So, welcome to another edition of Visual Basic Express 2012 for Business Programming. This is going to look at Linq, which is a data manipulation language. It's spelt L-I-N-Q, and it's designed to be very similar to SQL or SQL, as we often call it. I've created a typical form, typical for me at least. So I've got a text block here, and I've got here a button which I've put run link in its content field. So that's what we see on the screen. I'm going to double click on that to, I always love the way that happens, to get into the code. If that happens, make sure you've got pointer selected here, double click on it and it will go in. Now, we can use an array for our data source, although we can also obviously use a database. But just for this purpose at the moment, I will do this. That's creating an array with a defined set of data, a literal set of data. Generally speaking, you might do that for small arrays. Obviously, if you had a large array, you wouldn't. And in most cases, you probably want to not have values hard-coded, but it's a useful tool occasionally to be able to do this. So we're going to create a query, and in this case, we're going to say dim. Notice I've got an error there. Sorry. As integers. It's not as integers. Always check for the underlining. It's just as integer. Click off there, it's gone. Dim. Let's say evens query. Now, in SQL, we would have a piece of code that said something along the lines of select num from numbers where number divisible by 2. That's pseudocode. You don't actually say this part in SQL, but it gets across the idea of what we're trying to do. So dim evens query. In Linq, we're going to phrase that in a slightly different way. We're going to say from num in numbers. Helps if you get all the right letters in there. Where num mod 2 equals 0. Select num. Now, that blue underlining and the expression expected is an irritation. It goes away when you click outside the area. I'm not quite sure why it does it, but it's worth being aware of the fact that that can happen. What I'm going to do first now is add the numbers that are in that query has produced to the text blocks. Let's call this query execution. A text block as well, by the way. We're going to use for each number in evens query. And a for each is like a for loop, but it steps through. You don't need to have an index to point to the individual items. And there's text blocks 1 that we've got. Text block 1.text. And we're going to add to that number and vpcrlf. So that will add each of the elements to the text box. When I run it, we should see that working. As usual, it goes outside. Right, so when I run Linq, we see 02468. So that has selected only the even numbers. We can just check to make sure I'm not doing any weird magic. When num mod 3, it should now give us the ones that are divisible by 3 instead. And sure enough, when we run it, 0, 3, and 6 are the only numbers in this set for which the remainder is 0 when we divide by 3. I wanted also to just have a quick look at another idea which Visual Basic has, which is quite useful for laying out your code, particularly if you want to print code off. It often doesn't fit on the page. I'm sure you're familiar in C and similar languages. You have to put semicolons on the end of the line like that. You obviously don't have to do that in Visual Basic because you haven't seen any of those yet. Traditionally in Visual Basic you do have to include an underscore if you want to continue a line from one to the next. So here this would have been like this in the old days when I was a lad. You can still do that. Let me just run that again. Okay, so that still runs. But you don't need to have those there anymore, except in some special circumstances. So I can now, for instance, if this was a long line, I could press return there. That's still going to run. I'm not sure. Oops. Something weird going on there. Right, that's better. Even halfway through that sort of statement, I can put in a line feed. Run Linq. Yep, still works. Okay, so that can be useful for laying out your code so that it doesn't take up too much width and will print out okay. But it's worth being aware that it doesn't work everywhere. So if I put in a new line there, it doesn't work. I need the underscore for that to work. Or, if I don't like having the underscores there for these very few special occasions, if I just get rid of that again, I can break this at different places in the line. So let's put this here, and that means that the arguments are all obvious. And as long as this close brackets on the same line as the handles, like that, we can split it that way. And then I can start again. Still runs exactly the same way, but the code in some cases is then easier to read. White space can make a big difference to the readability of your code and makes no difference whatsoever to how well it runs. So that's a quick look at the very basics of Linq, of creating a query, of accessing the results of the query, this evens query here. Just before I go any further, it's worth putting a breakpoint on here, running this code again and using the debugger in order to see what the result of the evens query is, because you notice we didn't have an as in here. We're just declaring it, and it's declared as this Linq statement. So it's worth seeing here. This is an item that's called an in-memory query, and if I add a watch, I can make that bigger. Hold on, let's do that. It's the in-memory query, and if we open it up, it says here expanding will process the collection, so this actually does the query and shows us what the results are. So that's worth exploring. You can always put breakpoints in and go and explore what the actual values, the variables types are. Okay, so have a play with this sort of syntax, Linq. Well worth looking up the documentation that's on the net, and I'll do a bit more with this later using the same code to explore inline XML, which Visual Basic also now does.